Okay, guys, going to try something a little different this time. This is a video lecture. You will notice on Google Classroom that the Intro to Economics video lecture is there, the assignment itself, along with the link to this video. And you'll notice what I have done here is basically set this up as a Cornell-style notes-taking template. So on the left is the main ideas, the definition of economics, feudalism's definition. The bold print means it starts a new slide or new section, lords and serfs, why it declined, and working its way through. This ought to last probably about 30 minutes. One of the neat things about doing it this way, though, is that when you're in class with me, you may not be in the mood for it. You know what? You can do this on your own time. You can do a few minutes here and there, 10 minutes one night, 15 minutes the next. You see, at least in Zeger's class, the assignment would be due on Monday morning, October 9th at 7:45 a.m. And then we're going to use that time in class to discuss what questions you have and to go in a little bit more detail. So if you read the instructions as you go, take some notes. I've set up the main ideas on the left. Here on the right, you are capturing the details about it. Again, you add using as few words as possible, still showing that you get it, but you don't need to, in fact, you don't want to write down every single word because that's just not really a good use of your time. How can you abbreviate? How can you shorten? How can you make it quick? And please avoid just getting notes from a friend, pumping them into yours and turning them out. I will probably notice that. It wouldn't be your work, so it wouldn't be accepted, but also you're just not going to learn anything from this, and that's the real key, isn't it? And then as you go, consider any questions you have. It can be a open-ended question. Do we think that? Sure, do that. Or I'm really not understanding what mercantilism is. And if you look at the bottom of the document, there's a place for you to add at least 2 questions. And everybody should have submitted at least 2 of their own questions, either to further their understanding of the content or sort of big picture ideas. I wonder why you wanted more information about something. So that is the assignment, and that said, let's take a look at economics. And you know what? The first question going to be is, what's economics? And that's a really good question to start with. Well, this is, and please don't write this down, this would be so dull. If you go to a dictionary, you will see it's the social science concerned chiefly with the description, analysis, the production, distribution, consumptions of goods and services. And I'll tell you what, if you were a high school junior right now, you'd know all of these words and it would make perfect sense to you. Right now, I think you'd say, what? So let me simplify it for you. That's what I'm here for. How we get enough to survive or even prosper, do really well. That's it. If you think about it, economics in the days of our pre-civilization ancestors 100,000 years ago, how do we gather enough grains? How do we gather enough fruits? How do we capture enough animals to survive, to keep ourselves warm? That's what economics is. And today, although economists like to say we are a science, there's a lot of evidence that it's not as scientific as they think, but it's really about money, because money or credit or however it's defined is really what allows you to get the things you need in life. But that's a pretty new invention for human beings, as I think you know. All right, we're going to take a look at a system called feudalism. And you might stop for a second. It's a term that you might have heard before. Maybe stop the video for a second and see if it triggers anything. Oh, feudalism, isn't that like, like King Arthur or like knights and stuff? It is. So this is the main economic system of the Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages is kind of a strange term because they're not, why Middle Ages? Well, the idea is that after the Roman Empire fell apart, and that happened in the 5th century, finally and officially, until the Renaissance, which I know you studied last year in about the 14th, 15th century, it's a period that's just called by historians the Middle Ages. And you know what? In Europe, really what you're looking at is no real giant countries. There was no France, there was no Spain. And the really thing that linked people together might have been whose property they lived on, who the local lord or noble was, and even more so, Christianity. People identified themselves with their religion. Here's the idea. You might have, I say a king, but kings didn't really exist at that point. Perhaps they did in England, which is different, but wealthy nobles, I am Lord Fluffybottom, I am Lord the Fluffy Bottom, they would say in a French-speaking area. They were called lords, and they owned a large amount of land. Let's say it's from all the way here down to the Dubai Marina. And this is great because I am wealthy. I am a landowner. I get all the fruits that are grown, all the crops that are grown. I am a wealthy, powerful person. But here's the deal. I'm one person. How do I keep control of it? How do I make it productive? How do I stop people from rebelling? How do I stop somebody like Ms. Ross, who is a wealthy landowner in another part of Dubai, from coming in and taking my land? What I would do is I would identify two other lords, two other nobles, and say, you know what? You can take control of this part of the land. You take control of this. But, you got to give me something back. I'm not just giving for free. I'm not just a nice guy. You need to give me a percentage of the crops, of the food that you grow. Look, if I get attacked by Ross, y'all need to send soldiers called knights at that point, military service. You're here to defend me. And that's an arrangement that works for the wealthy noble at the top, but then for the lesser nobles that still get control over their own territory. But even dividing from here to the Dubai Marina in half, that's a lot of land. So that next noble would divide up the land that he got from the top noble and make the same arrangement. Okay, you guys can take control of this smaller area, maybe Majan or Al-Barari or something, but you owe to me part of what you grow on it, part of the wealth that you create, and if I get attacked and I need loyalty, I need knights or military service, you're going to provide the people to do this. So it's basically, in a moment you'll see a pyramid that explains all of this. At the very bottom is the serf. Another way to call serf is peasant, landless, owns nothing, is quote unquote tied to the land. Legally, in most cases, they couldn't leave. This is where most people were born, lived, died on that land. And there was nowhere to go. You might say, well, I don't want to live on Lord Fluffybottom's plantation. You know what? There was nowhere to go, and it was illegal. You had to be tied in. You would be tracked down and brought back. Should point out that probably 99, 98, 97, in the upper 90% of the people were serfs. There were very few people that owned any property at all that would have called themselves lords. I think because my beautiful face is there, you missed this. The system breaks down with the rise of towns or cities. And you start seeing this for a variety of reasons. One of the big reasons is the Crusades, and you might be familiar with this. I think you discussed it a little bit last year in grade 6. This is where Christians from Europe decided we need to go down to the so-called Holy Land. Now that would be modern day Israel, Palestine. It would include Jerusalem, where of course Jesus was crucified. It is now in the hands of Muslims. We need to recapture this Christian land for Christian people. And the Muslims that were there, of course, controlled the territory. Ultimately unsuccessful. There is a period in which the Christian armies from all over Europe, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of people, they begin in like the 1090s and they continue into the early 13th century. Remember with centuries, 13th century is years in the 1200s, so make sure you keep that straight. But over about a century, there are multiple attempts to take back, as it were, the Holy Land from the Muslim armies that controlled it in the Muslim states. Ultimately unsuccessful, but here's what it did. You have hundreds of thousands, probably even in the low millions, like a lot of men leaving their estates, leaving the lords, leaving where they had always lived, and moving across Europe, all the way across, back and forth onto ships, And you know what? As armies of 10, 60, 80,000 men and their followers and their cooks move through a new area, there are people that say, these people need food. These armies need a place to stay. They need to get their swords repaired. And you start finding other options for people living in these areas. And they start to little by little leave the plantations, leave the landed estates, and start sending up little cities. Once those little cities exist, people have a place to go. And there is even a saying, town air makes you free. If you can get off of the landed estate where you are but a serf, and you get to one of these towns, you are considered free at this point. By the way, going back to last year, you remember the bubonic plague? You remember the Black Death? Major role in the end of feudalism. Why? Because lords and serfs alike were dying by the millions. I mean, Europe's population declines by 20%, 30%. Nobody really knows exactly. So if your nobles are dead and you want to get away from where everyone's dying, you leave the estate, you leave the land, you set up a little community, a town. Really, feudalism did not recover from this. And this is just, and what's covered up by my face down here is, oh, and the 99%, these are the serfs at the very, very bottom. And that's, again, 99, 98% of the population. At the top, although kings were not that common at this point, these are at least top nobles, extraordinarily wealthy people at the top. And some might have called themselves kings, but for the most part, they weren't recognized outside of a certain area. Below that, we have they're called vassals, but they are top level lords, and they own a lot of power and a lot of property that they get from the top lord or the king, and they give some of that out to people below them. And this only shows 1, 2, 3, 4 levels. There were probably 8, 9, 10 levels in some bigger areas. But you'll notice everybody at every level gives and gets something. The guy at the top gets the wealth, the power, everything else, however, gives up some of his land to the other wealthy nobles who get the wealth from that, but they owe loyalty and military aid up top, and they give some of the land to lesser nobles below them who give the same loyalty. And at the bottom, you might say the serfs get nothing. Well, they don't get a lot. Their life is short, it is difficult, it is unpleasant, not much diet, there is starvation in many areas, but they do at least get access to food and they have shelter. So it's something that doesn't work real well for most peasants, but it's not as if they get nothing out of it. And the key thing is, why don't the peasants leave? Where are they going to go? Where are they going to go? It's illegal to leave, and there is nowhere to go. This system holds up, and again, this is a good time to remind you that if you are copying down every single word on this slide, it's not worth your time. How can you take these, 130 words, maybe 110 words, don't know, and reduce that to maybe 20? That's what you want to do. This is called mercantilism, and mercantile suggests business or wealth more than anything. By pre-industrial, we have been looking at the Industrial Revolution. Well, this is before then, and it's really the dominant replacement idea behind economics after feudalism. 15th to 18th century, that's 1500s through the 1700s. You'll remember Richard Arkwright's invention, 1770, something like that. The steam engine by the late 1700s. Early industrialization around 1800. And this is where we can start talking about kings for real. You know what? A king is just the top lord, the top noble. If I am the lord of my domain and I control everything from here to the Dubai Marina, maybe I become powerful enough with enough wealth and enough military that I can go to Suzanne Ross and I can go to Ms. Z and I can go to Ashley Holland and say, look, guys, I'm more powerful than you are. I'm taking over. Recognize me as your king. But I'm really the top lord, and they become my vassals, or the low below me. The theory behind this was that there is a limited amount of wealth in the world, and gold is really how it was measured. And so the idea was, if there were only, let's say, 100 units of wealth in the world, let's just, sorry, a little glitch there. I started to cough. Well, I'm not sure. I don't see my little counter clicking here, so I really hope this is continuing to record, but we'll see. We'll see. Um, the idea would be if there's only, let's say, 100 units worth of wealth, and wealth is food and it's land and it's money and it's gold. But let's just assume that there is a chunk, there is this much wealth in the world. This is all of it. You can't create wealth. You can destroy it by burning it up, but this is it. The idea would be, as the king, I want to control as much as possible, as close to 100% as I can get. Hence, I want to avoid trading, because if I'm trading, I'm the king of France and I have, let's say, a German king. I don't want to trade, if I can avoid it, something of value to that other king, because then I'm giving up some of the world's wealth. That's the problem with that. So, how do I get, if I am in England and I'm trying to produce cloth or I'm trying to build things with wood, how do I get the supplies I need? I want to avoid trade. Colonies. And this is the period where the British in particular, but also the French and also the Dutch, but let's just look at England because that's where the Industrial Revolution started, the British begin to set up colonies in the Americas. They start sending colonists to North America, which becomes the United States in the early 1600s. The Spanish are doing the same thing. That's why everybody in South America, Latin America, Central America, or most people speak Spanish. Therefore, they could control the colonies, take the wealth back to the mother country, to England or to Spain or Zygeria, my favorite country, and keep the wealth within their system. Here's the key. The monarch, the king, makes the main decisions about the economy. In other words, you might be a wealthy landowner and you are producing wheat on your farm, and you say, you know what? I can only get 20 French francs per bushel here in France, but there's a shortage in Spain. If I bring my grain, my wheat over the border into Spain, I can get 30 francs per bushel. And the king, to the best of his ability, would send his men out and say, oh no, you're sending something valuable out of my country. Therefore, you need to sell your stuff here in France. So the king controlled, to the best of his ability, the economy. That's mercantilism. And again, you see just a little chart. We'll look at this in class maybe so we can understand this. I don't think I need to say too much more with this right now. This begins to change, and this is a guy who changes the world in ways absolutely wonderful and maybe troubling in some ways. Remember with Richard Arkwright, his invention, wow, was incredible. It created so much wealth. It made things better for a lot of people, and it jump-started later inventions that made things, change the world, absolutely. And you can say people live longer and people live better and people have more stuff and people have more food because of industrialization. 100% true. There were problems with taking people out of their family lives and forcing them into, awful factories. And in the long run, we know there are major environmental concerns. That's the thing. You go to Mr. Quinn's class, it's pretty easy. 5 plus 5 equals 11. That is the answer. There's no debate about it. But in history, was the Industrial Revolution good for human society or bad? There's a long answer to that, and two very smart people may not necessarily agree. So Adam Smith was from Scotland. I'm dumping a bunch of stuff up here. Again, you don't really need to, copy down every word. That would not be good use of your time. And also, understand that you may not fully understand this without us talking about it in class. He wrote a book. It's called Wealth of Nations, and he wrote it in 1776. For those of you who know U.S. history a little bit, that was the year of the Declaration of Independence, and many Americans, because the United States considers itself a model of a capitalist society, says, wow, we become an independent country the same year that the book, the Bible, as it were, of capitalism is published. He is considered the father of modern capitalism, and he rejected mercantilism. He rejected the idea that there is a limited amount of wealth in the world, number one, and that it made sense for countries to avoid trade and for government to try to control people, what they did with their money. I'm going to teach you a little French right now. He said, all things equal, government should not control the economy. It should use a laissez-faire system. You see it underlined. Laissez-faire is French, and it means literally to leave to do, or better, to leave alone. And Adam Smith, and we're going to address him more in this class, said, here's what's going to create wealth. If government, as much as possible, stands back and lets the economy run, lets people take their own money, lots of money or little money, and work to increase it, to invest it, they will work harder. They will work more creatively because they benefit. In other words, that's self-interest. If you tell me that I should keep my farm going, my massive plantation, and produce a ton of grain to benefit the government, to benefit the king, I'll do it, but without much enthusiasm. And Adam Smith says, oh no, if you give people an incentive, if you give them the opportunity to personally benefit, they're going to do more. And rather than have a limited amount of wealth in the world that our country wants to get as much as possible, by encouraging people to work hard, to create, to invest, we are going to see an increase of wealth. And you know what? Let's openly trade. Hey, England is great at producing sheep for wool. France is fantastic at producing wine. You know what? France is terrible land for producing sheep. And English wine, I've never tried it, but it sounds pretty ghastly. Well, under the mercantile system, the British would produce their sheep, produce their wool, and then waste a lot of their time and resources making really awful wine. And the French would be doing the opposite. Adam Smith said, wait a minute, let's let private sheep herders, sheep growers who shear the wool, produce as much of this as they possibly can, produce so much wool, more than England can use itself. Let's take that and have them trade it to the French, who will not be wasting their time on the sheep that don't live very well in French land, but they'll produce this magnificent wine and they'll produce a lot of it. They trade back and forth, they both produce more, the amount of wealth increases. And that will create more wealth for everyone. I'm going to come back to the invisible hand, but the idea is, hey, how much should we produce of wheat, apples, in today's world, cars, and what should the price be? It's a natural process. There is an optimal place where the price and the amount produced will meet. We'll look at that in class, so you can leave that part blank on the notes. By the way, Adam Smith, and I won't spend too much time with this, but he is often being treated today as, oh yeah, he hated government. He says that leave it to rich people, everything will be fine. Adam Smith did not believe that at all. And you know what? I'm going to call these slides up in class to see if you can make sense of them. Adam Smith was first and foremost, he was a believer in ethics, in morality, in creating a better society. And while he saw tremendous ability for people to be motivated to use their own wealth in society to create more, using self-interest, he thought that could be very good for society. But he did not for a second believe, oh, trust the rich to make their money to help the rest of us. Never believed that at all. He wasn't anti-government, he was anti-too much government. All right, this is the bummer guy. This is Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was I believe, a Protestant minister, an Anglican minister. Notice when he wrote this, he wrote it in 1798. Now, this is right when the Industrial Revolution was beginning. It was just starting to kick in. And Thomas Malthus was looking around and said, man, Britain's population. I know that in 1750 it was about 7 million people. 50 years later, because the food supply is better, because people are living a little bit longer, wow, the population's at 10 million. You know what? 50 years from now, it's going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And yes, we will produce more food. There's no doubt about that because there's more land out there. There is land across the world and in the colonies. But here's the problem. And he would say, look, right now we have this much food and this much population. And we might say that, every 25 years, the amount of food will increase a little bit. I'm going to draw this in class for you because it's going to make more sense. Sure, food supply will increase, new lands, etc. Here's the problem. The average British woman was having 6 children. So 2 parents, 6 children, 36 grandchildren, 216 great-grandchildren, 1,300 great-great-grandchildren. Do you see what's happening here? Food supply is growing steadily and slowly, Thomas Malthus said. Population is going to grow so quickly because of all the children. And eventually what's going to happen? We're going to starve. We're going to be hungry. It's going to be a war of all against all. End of story. See, this guy was no fun at a party, was he? In reality, we're going to talk this in class because this is pretty complicated. So if you're not able to get this now, don't worry about it. It appears that Thomas Malthus was probably wrong. And again, I will leave this, but if you want to spend a moment looking at what's called the demographic transition model. Now, a model is an example. Transition means change. Demo means people or population. Graphic means record. So, the record of the population transitioning or changing. He argues that through most of human history, lots of children born, death rates were high. You know what? You had 12 kids, 2 or 3 survived to adulthood, and for most of human history, there is no total change in the population. We saw that with the population drops in class. Eventually, around the time that Thomas Malthus is writing, the population is continuing. The birth rate is still really high, but because there's more food, and especially when modern medicine comes a little bit after Thomas Malthus, the death rate drops. All of what you're seeing here in green, that's population growth. So the population of England, which might be 7 million in 1750, by 1900, it's 35 million. And if you keep multiplying that times 5, it would mean today there would be like, what, 175 million people in the UK, and you'd have 1 billion people in the UK alone another 150 years from now. And obviously, the world couldn't support that. We'd run out of food, we would all die, etc., etc. But Thomas Malthus did not see what was happening. What do you see happening to the birth rate? It begins to drop to the point where you're seeing in countries today, like most of Western Europe, the United States, and especially Japan, the birth rate and the death rate are both low. The average, as I mentioned, the average Japanese woman has 1.31 children in her lifetime, and Japan is probably moving to a point where population will drop because 20 adults will have 13 children. Thomas Malthus did not see this. This is not government policy. This is apparently natural that as societies modernize, as
They move into cities where it's expensive to have four, five, six, seven, 8 children. You want to have one or two, if any at all, in most cases. And you can feel confident with modern medicine that if you have 2 children, they're very likely going to survive into the old age. And you live in areas where you don't depend on your children to take care of you when you get older. There is Social Security and government programs and all this kind of stuff. We'll talk about this more in class. Some problems with capitalism. You know what? We'll come back to these numbers, but it seems to create, without any control, a very wealthy few and a lot of people that are quite different. So you'll see this here. We'll take a look at this later. Quick look at pros and cons. Look, capitalism creates wealth. There is no question about this. It creates a lot of wealth. Absolutely, absolutely. Because you keep the fruits of your labor, of your innovation, of your investment. There is motivation for you. There are problems, though. Lack of equality, that gap between rich and poor, and external costs. This is kind of a grown-up phrase, but I think y'all can handle it. External means outside. Hey, I just built 11 factories and there are millions around the world. How much do they cost? Well, they cost 2,000 to 2 million dirhams each. But outside costs, what we're talking about is environmental problems. That's a cost. It may not cost money, but it costs society, and it tends not to be factored into the cost of the products. We'll talk about this in class again, somewhat complicated. Finally, a guy writing about 50, 75 years after Adam Smith. Karl Marx has watched the world go from your villages that you first grew them, this nice little bucolic area with small families living in a fairly natural area, to these massive crowded cities with smog, with pollution that are filthy, where workers are working 20-hour days, 15-hour days, children are being forced to work, disease is spreading in the cities, and he said, you know what? This is terrible. This can't last. It is destroying human beings, and let me tell you what's going to happen. Now, Karl Marx was a brilliant guy. Karl Marx was a thoughtful guy. Karl Marx also considered his ideas to be scientific because he said, you know, and those you see his books up there, the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, which are 2 books he wrote. You don't need to know the titles, but just FYI. He said, let me tell you what history is. It is a history of class struggle. Now, classes means social class and generally means rich and poor. In Karl Marx's day, there really wasn't that middle class in the middle. It was a few very rich and a lot of very poor. And Marx says it's always been like this. You know, in caveman days, you had big, strong caveman, have big cave, club people on head, take many women. And then you had all the other cavemen that put up with it, but they didn't like it, and they wanted more for themselves. And so they start to fight back, and using their superior numbers, they attack that big caveman guy, and the system falls apart. Cut ahead many, many, many thousands of years later, we have feudalism. This is all Karl Marx's idea. He says, I've read history. I know how history works, and I think, I know I can predict what's going to happen next. In feudalism, you had those few land-owning elite, the lords, 1% of the population, and they controlled everything. And you had that 99% of the population, the desperately poor serfs. Now, what is the goal of the wealthy lords? To get more land, get more wealth. What is the goal of the serfs? To work hard so their lords become wealthier? No, to get something for themselves, to get food, to live better, to live longer, to have some sense of freedom, to live a better life. And Marx said, look, this took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But eventually, that conflict between the classes, between the lords and the serfs, it continued to brew. And every time the peasants rose up, the lords were able to bring in their armies and crush them. But eventually, what happened? The superior numbers of the serfs overturned the lords, and the feudal system crashed to the ground.
And out of the ashes of the death of feudalism came capitalism. And who, Marx said, are the haves and have-nots? It's the owners and the workers. Now, he had special terms for them. He called the workers the bourgeoisie. It's a French term, obviously, but that means the owners of the wealth. It meant the landlords, the factory owners, the bankers, the wealthy. And the working class called the proletariat. These are the people that go into these factories and work because the world was moving into cities and industrialism. Now, the goal of the bourgeoisie, the wealthy owners of factory and banks, to make more money for themselves. And that probably involves overworking the workers and paying them as little as possible. And if a bunch of workers died because they didn't have enough food, hey, there's always more workers. What's the goal of the proletariat, the working class? Is it to work as hard as they can, work themselves to death so that the owner of the factory can become richer? No, it's to create a better life for themselves and their family. So they would organize unions, they would protest, they would fight back, but the wealthy landowner would either hire a private army or just call in the government, the prime minister or the president or the king in some place and say, hey, I'm having trouble with these workers, crush them. They'd send in the army, they'd put an end to the strike. But over time, Marx said, as the pressure grows, as more and more and more working people move into these cities, and it gets more and more crowded, and they're more and more angry, they will band together as workers, and they will overthrow the bourgeoisie. Workers will take control of the factories, of the wealth, of the homes, the banking. And this is a brand new system. Capitalism will destroy itself because it's set up to destroy itself. And out of that comes something that Marx called communism. Socialism, communism, they're different terms, but we won't worry about this. In this, all the wealth in society is owned by all of the people together. And that's the idea behind it. Important. The word inevitable means it's gonna happen. I think it's a problem with Marx. Nobody can predict the future. I can barely predict the past, and that already happened. But he said, this isn't something that could happen or should happen. It's gonna happen. Great, I got you through. I said 30 minutes, looks like 37 minutes. That's not too bad. Again, should be taking notes on this, your own notes. Avoid just copying words directly from this, and please don't share them with people. You can talk to people, but do not share each other's documents. I don't want to see the same words copied down to everybody's. In Zeger's class, this is due Monday morning, October 9th at 7:45 a.m. I'm not sure about Ross's class. You'll have to talk to her about that individually. And also remember at the end, at least 2 questions, and it can be, I don't understand this. Could you go into more detail? Or if you had a creative, interesting thought about it, maybe that's, that could be something that you might want to ask as well. Thank you, everybody. See ya. Wouldn't want to